All right. All right, everybody, we're going to jump into talking about the Typographers M. Typographers M is a horizontal space equal to the type's point size. It's also a vertical measure. So the M space for a 10-point font would be 10 points of horizontal space, but it also goes 10 points of vertical space. The M for a 48-point font would be 48 points of horizontal space. You might think we'll measure type vertically, but it's actually horizontally is how we measure. It's the point size, not the design, that determines the size of the typographer's M. And let me explain a little bit more about what that means. So a typeface is sized so that all the parts can fit within an M space. And so down here in this illustration, you'll see there's a 10-point M. And up here you can see that the typeface, it's not the edge to edge, top to bottom, but it means that the entire alphabet has to fit: the capital letters, the ascender lowercase letters, the descender lowercase letters. Every type has to fit within that width of 10 points for that 10-point size. That means that it's not like edge to edge, it's referencing all the different variables of the typeface. So the width of the letters vary. So they don't usually use all the M units for that particular letter, because it's different letter. A W is very different in scale than a capital I. And so it's not as obvious of how typefaces are measured when we're talking about when you're choosing a 32-point font or of Helvetica or a 32-point font of Garamond. They might look actually quite different in size, because again, they're not measured by height, they're measured by width, but width of the widest letter and of the lowest descender and the highest ascender. So it's not a real obvious way to understand how it looks. So I'm going to jump to another presentation. I kind of going to go a little between different presentations here to talk about that. So let's talk about X height. So here's an example of 32-point font: Scala Pro, 32-point Interstate Regular, 32-point Bodoni, and 32-point Mrs. Eves. They're all 32 points, 4 different typefaces. So when 2 typefaces are set in the same point size, one often looks bigger than the other. The difference here is the X height, line weight, and width affects the letter's apparent scale. So if we look at this, the 32-point Interstate obviously looks much bigger than the Mrs. Eves, right? Mrs. Eves has a very short X height, so it feels very small. Interstate has a very high X height, and it also has a thicker stroke. So all in all, Interstate, which is the words look fat, looks fat compared to the word paragraph. So be aware that 32 points in different typefaces can look very different. It's not going to look the same, because it's really not about the height of the X height, which is what you might think it is, but it isn't. And that can be very confusing if you're like, I'm trying to pair 2 different typefaces together in the same document. So you might be confused at why does one look so much bigger in the same point size as another? This is why. Here's another example of X heights. Mr. Big versus Mr. and Mrs. Little. So we have Helvetica here on the left, 32 points, high X height. Mr. and Mrs. Eves, low, the small X height, very small X height. Both are 32 points. So the X height is what makes a typeface look like its apparent size. It gives it its overall visual impact. Like hemlines and hairstyles, X heights go in and out of fashion. Bigger type bodies become popular in the mid-20th century, making letter forms look larger by maximizing the area within overall point size. So typefaces like Mr. and Mrs. Eves are based on, 16th century ideals. And so their delicate proportions are about, that humanistic quality, and they're trying to be very delicate, and they include things like ligatures and old style kind of nuances. I'm going to come back to this. I'll come back. I'm going to go back over here to kerning and tracking. All right. Kerning and tracking. We measure these also in thousandths of an M. Kerning is a term that is the adjustment of space between pairs of letters. So just two letters. So you're going to see this symbol, the A with a slanted line and a V. You'll see this symbol in your type windows in Illustrator, in InDesign, and this is referring to just adjusting the space between two letters, not the whole word, not the whole paragraph, just two. Tracking is the adjustment of space for groups of letters. So again, it's the symbol AV, but with the line underneath it, with the arrows. This is saying we're going to change the spacing between all the letters in the word or all the letters in the paragraph. Everything is going to be equally spaced out. All right, scale. The world is flat, is being laid out two different ways. On the left here, we're going to call that a type crime, because the world the word world is bigger than the is flat, but it's so minimal you can hardly tell. It feels very arbitrary and it's barely recognizable. Whereas in the right column, you can see the scale and contrast is great. The world is flat. World is much like 3 times the size of the is flat. And so this design is dynamic, it's decisive, it gives depth of field, it really shows presence. So it gives a hierarchy as well. So like when we're working right now in our airport names for our luggage tags, the idea of really having good contrast between different words to highlight or to really emphasize a word, really having good contrast is important. And this is an example of that. Scale also matters when we're looking at the size of the type based on the overall size of the piece. So for example, this is a very small little book. Making the type really large on the page really gives it a sense of presence. If this was really tiny type in a tiny book, it wouldn't be as dynamic. This is giving a lot of dynamic. It's something to think about even for yourselves when you're placing your word mark on your luggage tag. Putting the scale of your mark on that tag, you can really play up how big it is so that it really feels like it has good presence. Here's an example of abbreviations for cities being used in different scale for information graphics. So the larger the abbreviation is, the more of that issue is being addressed. And so it's showing by population what population has more of the issue that they're addressing. All right. Let's go back to some things we learned last week. Last week we learned leading is the space between the lines measured from baseline to baseline. So we know it's the space between, and we're always aligning baseline to know how much leading is between the lines. We used our type gauges and found that out. We can also refer to that as line spacing. Of course, leading is the term we learned from back when we were using movable type, when they were using literally bars of lead to separate the lines of type. So now we are going to look at letting 3 different ways. Who can tell me by looking at the numbers below, which number is the point size and which number is the letting? We have 1210, 1215, 1225. So in other words, what is 12 referring to and what is the number to the right referring to?
12 is a point size.
Well, repeat one more time.
A 12 is a point size.
Yes, 12 is the point size. And then number to the right of it is the letting. Absolutely. So let's get a little closer look here. Let me grab this. All right, let's look at this one. It's a little blurry because I've blown it up so much, but I want you to tell me, can you read that? How easy is it? Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to move that. How easy is it for us to read the copy that is set on 12 points over 10-point letting? What's happening?
The letting is like really squished, it's hard to read.
Yeah, because what's happening is our ascenders and descenders are like literally bumping into each other. You can see them like hitting each other. They're bumping, and the Y is running into the dot of the I in geometric, and so on and so forth. Because the letting is actually a smaller point size than the point size of the body copy. So a type crime is happening. We don't want to have ever the letting to be the same as the point size or less. So in other words, if it's 12-point type, the letting should be always larger than 12, never 12, and never less. So you never want to do that, and this is why. It's hard to read. It's all bumping into each other. This would be a nightmare to have to read a whole book set like that. Okay, let's move over to the next one. This paragraph, 12 on 15. What do we think?
I think it's a little better than the first one.
Just a little better? It
I
is
mean,
better.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It is better. But I think it's a lot better. I'm going to say that because I think this feels very comfortable. This feels like most of the books you have, right? It's very easy to read. None of the ascenders or descenders are bumping into anybody, and it feels comfortable. This is a 3-point difference in letting. This is actually a good benchmark for letting. We want to see 3 points between our point size and our letting. Now, again, what we just talked about is X heights really affect the size of the type. So if we're using a typeface that has a really high X height, sometimes we might need to go to 4 points. Or if we're using an X height, a typeface that has a really short X height, we might only go 2 points different. The X height is going to determine it. But on average, a good rule of thumb is if you set your point at size at 12, you want your letting at 15. You want it 3 points difference. So that 3-point differential is a good rule of thumb you want to look for. It's a good place to start. You can always adjust. But if you want to start somewhere, that's where I would start. And so then finally, we're going to go over here to the 12 on 25. This letting is more than twice the size of our point size. What happens in this situation? Try reading it. How does it feel reading that? It's not terrible. We can read it. But what happens if we had a whole lot of copy set double spaced basically like this, it makes it hard for our brain to keep track of where we are. And what happens is we end up start rereading the same lines over and over again. Our brain disconnects from it. There's too big of a gap. And so we get lost a lot. Have you ever done that? Have you ever read something and find yourself rereading the same line over and over again? It's usually because either the line length is too long or there's too much space between the lines. Those are the two things that create that phenomenon. So you want to make sure that, yes, we use this kind of double spacing. Sometimes we use it for intro type, like introduction to a section in a book or on a page, but we try not to set a lot of type in this because it does make it more difficult to read, and the issues are legibility. All right, so let's go back to kerning. So kerning, we talked to you is about what? What are we when we're kerning, what are we looking at? The whole word or just two letters?
Just two letters.
Right. So let's look at this word. And are there any two letters that could use some kerning? Meaning the spacing doesn't look quite right. What do you think?
RNA.
RNA, absolutely. They're bumping into each other. Good. What else?
V and E.
Absolutely. V and E also bumping into each other. Anything else?
A and V. It's
A
kind of
and V, yes. Too much space. Anything else?
Second A and G.
Absolutely. You guys are good. You got them all. These are the areas that are not, that are causing problems. And this is what it should look like. This is where we were. And this is what's corrected. Okay, very subtle, but it's something we're working on our eyes to see. Tracking the overall space between letters. So we refer to them in three different ways: positive tracking, zero tracking, and negative tracking. Zero tracking is exactly how it comes right when you type it in. You've chosen your typeface, you start typing, that's zero tracking. You haven't changed it in any way. Positive tracking, of course, you've added space. And we sometimes do that, you know, to emphasize a word in a mark, or sometimes we use it for specific characters. We'll talk about it shortly, like small caps or condensed typefaces. Negative tracking, it's rare that we use it, but sometimes we're going to use a little bit of negative tracking when we're using justified text, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But zero tracking should always be pretty good. Now, the exception to that is, how many of us have ever gone into the depths of the wild, wild internet and found free fonts? I'm not talking about Adobe fonts. I'm talking like free fonts. Anyone ever downloaded a free font off the
I
internet?
have, yeah, guilty.
Okay. And so now this isn't a hard and fast rule, but a lot of times when you download a free font, you're going to find that when you start typing out with it, your words and your type that you're going to create with it, the zero tracking is not accurate. It's kind of all wonky and all over the place. Unfortunately, a lot of our free fonts that are out there are designed by amateurs, and a lot of them they've designed the typeface, but they haven't put the time and energy into creating the correct spacing and building that into the typeface. And so a lot of times you'll type out something with a free font and the spacing between the letters is all off and a little wonky. And then you find yourself spending a lot of time using positive and negative tracking and kerning to get it looking correctly. So be aware of that when you're choosing free fonts, and check the spacing and how well that particular font was designed with spacing. Now, there are quite a few very good Google free fonts. So I would say of the free fonts that are out in the world, Google has a lot of good ones. And I actually have a list from Google of like some of the best free fonts from Google. If anyone, we'll kind of get into that a little later when we get into screen fonts. And Google does a lot of good screen fonts. But I'm talking about like kind of these kind of off in the wild offshoots that I don't know where you get them. Some of those can be very, very poorly designed. All right, so we want to try to avoid positive tracking and negative tracking, but rules are flexible and made to be broken on occasion. But in general, you should be able to stick around zero tracking in most of the work you're doing. So here's an exception, small caps. So that first line you see here is, you can see how tightly the tracking is on the small caps. So adding a little positive tracking can really help separate the letters and not let them bump into each other. So speaking of small caps, we've kind of touched on this already, but we're going to go over it one more time. Small caps are designed to match the X height of lowercase letters. They're not capital letters just shrunk down. I'm going to show you what I mean. So when you want to use small caps, you do not use false caps. That means you don't take a capital letter and just shrink it down to the X height of your lowercase letters. You actually go up to your type choices and choose a typeface that has a small cap option. Okay. Garamond, being an old style typeface, does have a small cap option. So true small caps are integrated peacefully with lowercase letters. That means the stroke weight is the same as the lowercase letter stroke weight. So they feel very cohesive. If we look at the second line, pseudo small caps are shrunken versions of full-size caps. So notice the full-size caps and the lowercase typeface are the same stroke weight. But if we go over here to the word pseudo small caps, they look like they're a lighter stroke weight. That's because they've been shrunken, and the stroke weight is also shrunken when you shrink a typeface. So the weight is not proper. So these are going to feel like they're too light in color because their stroke weight is not the same as the lowercase and the full size. So the next thing to be aware of when we're choosing typefaces for projects, and especially if we have a project that involves a lot of numbers, and we're going to have this later in the semester. So here's a paragraph set with lining numbers. Lining numerals act as capital letters. So you'll notice that all of the numbers are standing up from the baseline and going up to the cap height. So they stick out in this paragraph. You can really see them because they're sticking out like capital letters would. And this is a paragraph of type with uppercase and lowercase letters. In contrast, here is an example of old style numerals. Old style numerals work with the X height, and they behave like lowercase letters. So they have ascenders and descenders. So notice how much more blending in these numbers are to the body copy. They blend in because they behave like lowercase letters with their ascenders and descenders, and they are only the height of the X height. So sometimes you want your numbers to blend in, and sometimes you want your numbers to stand out. So you have to choose, what are you looking for in your overall design? Do you want your numbers to stand out like capital letters? Or do you want them to blend in like lowercase letters? Here's what they look like side by side. The top row are the old style numbers, and the bottom row is the lining numbers. So when you're choosing a typeface for a project, it's important to know what you, especially if you have a project, think of things like menus, like you're doing a menu for a restaurant. Maybe you're doing an annual report for companies sharing their financials. Maybe you're doing a recipe and you need to have a quantities. So when you're choosing typefaces for those kinds of projects, you always want to look at the numbers And some typefaces give you options. You can have both lining numbers and old style numbers in some typefaces. Some typefaces only have one or the other. It just depends. Okay, stacked letters. What do we think? What is the least legible of all of these choices? What do we think?
The last one, I think, because it's going 2 different directions.
2 different directions. Yeah, exactly. That makes it complicated for people. Like what's going on here? Yeah, exactly. Anything else? What else is difficult, if anything?
I kind of ran into this problem when I was doing my airport codes, but like the first and the second one, just depending on how thin they are, just what letter you're typing out, and just it looks weird to the eye based on like how many lines you're looking at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You never, ever, ever want to put lowercase letters vertically. So that's the first rule. Do never put lowercase letters vertically. This is a dotted line because there's a couple occasions where this works. If you're doing the Chicago theater sign on the side of a building and you're going to make it in like flashing lights, there are opportunities like all uppercase kind of coming down as a signage on a building can sometimes work very well, but they need to be uppercase. You can never use lowercase. So uppercase letters, yes. But the preferred way is if you're going to have your copy, your word go vertical, is to set it and turn it like you're seeing here. And it can go either bottom to down, top to bottom, bottom up. It can go either way. But the one thing you do not want to do is have them go 2 different ways. That really hurts legibility when they're going 2 different ways. If you're going to add a secondary line of copy, they should be going the exact same way, not different ways. All right. Perfect. We're going to just, there we go.